Hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar on making the case for continuous listening. I'm really pleased today to be joined by Ben Eubanks, all the way from Las Vegas. So, hi, Ben.
Hey there, Scott. I'm excited to be here. It's going to be a fun conversation, and I'm going to challenge you a little bit, so it's always good.
Yeah, could you actually, before we dive in, could you maybe just take a minute to tell us a little bit about yourself, please, Ben?
Sure, absolutely. So I lead the HR research practice. I'm a principal analyst at Lighthouse Research, which really means I'm a data geek a little bit. I love digging into the numbers, understanding what separates the great companies from the not so great ones, and whether that's a technology, a strategy, some sort of innovation. I love diving into those things and highlighting those. And again, that really weaves into the conversation today, I think, because the companies that I know that are really at the front edge of engaging their employees are doing things like continuous listening versus some of the other alternatives we'll talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think one of the reasons that we'll get into that is I know that you and I meet with lots of companies on our travel, so it would be good to, as you say, for you to challenge, I think, some of the thoughts that I'll share with everybody, and then maybe we can illustrate as well with stories of some of the companies that we've met. I think it's always helpful to really try to bring these things to life if we can.
Yep, absolutely.
So maybe we'll start off with a definition of continuous listening. And we often do talk about continuous listening as a way of complementing annual engagement surveys, and we'll come on to that in a second. Quite often, we help customers, and we see a lot of companies will do an annual survey. So maybe every January they'll do an all hands annual engagement survey. And sometimes these things start out with 40 or 50 questions, and then over time, actually, we do have some customers that have 100+ questions, and it's a big exercise, and it's really important for the business, and everybody in the business takes part in these. One of the things, though, that we've noticed a little bit is that individual engagement can change over the course of a year. So in between one annual engagement survey and the other, an individual engagement can change. And you think about a typical year of an employee that they go through. That's quite natural, I suppose, in many sense. So, we do get questions from customers saying, well, as well as or instead of listening on an annual basis, what if we could listen continuously and take action as we learn? So I suppose that the first question for you, Ben, is this the kind of thing that you're hearing as well on your travels?
Yeah, so actually it's funny because last week I was having a conversation. I was at an event in Texas, and was talking to a client, and they were explaining that they actually have, you're sitting down, right, 150% turnover in their staff every year. And so when she picked me up off the floor, I'm trying to understand, wrap my mind around that. She said, if we could find some way to even nudge some of those people to stick around for even a few months longer. We're not trying to change that from 150% to 10%. We just want to change it a little bit. We can get people to stay for a few more months. It's millions of dollars of impact on our bottom line. And so I see things like this as opportunities to really understand those kind of things and really stay on top of what's going on and stay on top of the hot buttons, the issues, instead of finding out about them, next January when it's too late to help those people that have already left. You find out when it happens, and you can take action on it, hopefully resolve that to some degree.
Wow. 150%. I mean, that's like everybody in the office that you look around at and see right now, and they'll all be gone, and half of the others that join as well. That's quite a thing.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I was at a customer in the UK recently, and we helped them with their annual survey, and the HR director, we were speaking to him about doing his next annual survey, which falls at the end of May, beginning of June. And completely unprompted, actually, he said to me, Scott, sometimes I do worry that maybe our engagement might fall between one survey and the next. And we might be storing ourselves up problems. You mentioned there staff turnover. we were talking with him about other things like absenteeism, which we know is connected to engagement. So, he said actually things could be going wrong for 6 months before our next annual survey picks that up again. And I suppose in a worst case scenario, it could even be 11 or 12 months, before you find out something. So a question back at you. Do you think then that the annual engagement survey is dead?
So I go back and forth on this. There's a spectrum of companies, right? There's on one end, there's those that aren't doing anything at all yet. Still, they're still holding off on that survey, and it might be because they're kind of worried about what they're going to hear from their employees. They're kind of aware of what the general problems are, and they're afraid for employees to put those down, because then there's the expectation that the company's going to do something about it. So those companies aren't doing anything yet. And on the other end of the spectrum are companies like the ones that you and I are talking to. They're saying, hey, we realize there's a problem, and the things we've been doing are not getting it. So we need to look for the continuous listening sort of model and try to understand those things. And somewhere in the middle of those companies, they're saying, hey, we don't have the wherewithal, we don't have the focus, or we're not even mature enough in our thinking to go towards that angle. So we need something at least. So I think the annual survey fits that bill. But I think the big change, the piece of it that is dead, is that one where you bring in a 6-figure consulting firm, and they do this analysis, and it takes 6 months for them to get to the actual results and get those back to you in some format you can act on. Because again, like the example I gave a little bit ago, by the time you get that back, 25, 30, 40% of those people that had issues, that raised issues, are gone now. And so you miss that chance to actually impact it for them.
Yeah, what about the other extreme? I guess we've all seen in the news recently, Amazon actually do sort of a real mini survey every day. So when employees log on to their systems, they are met with an engagement question, which they answer before they get into their system. So, do you think we're heading to that extreme of once a day or even more frequently, maybe?
So the thing that gets me there is that you don't want to take action on something that pops up maybe one day and never shows up again. And so I'm always careful about that. The same way, let's say yesterday Scott had a battle with his boss, and he had a rough day, and just so happens that yesterday was the day that we dropped the engagement survey. And so his boss got torn up, got blasted, negative. But the other 360 days a year, Scott's happy with his work. And so that shows up as a weird blip on the radar. I like continuous because it kind of takes out some of those ups and downs. It flattens that curve a little bit. But doing it every single day, you might have those kinds of issues where something happens and, hey, you had a bad day, and it's going to show up there. So there's nothing wrong with asking those things just as a daily basis. Hey, it could be a button. There's actually a company I know of that when you're logging into your intranet for your HR system, you hit the button. The login button is either a happy face or a sad face, and that's your login when you're logging in. So it doesn't require anything extra from the person. It's just a quick check on them. But I'd be careful about using that very, very small data point unless you're seeing trends there, and then it might show you something. So hopefully that kind of gets to the root of that. It's one of those things where it's nice to know, but it's also one of those things you don't want to jump on and use as this big waving flag that there's an issue if you see somebody log in, with a unhappy face one day a week or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that leads us on to the next thing. So, I guess I hear most often that people want to measure something on a weekly basis. People talk about monthly. As you say, some people talk about daily. It feels like a weekly cadence is about right. But you don't want to be asking people, are you aligned with company strategy this week, or there's lots of things that you could kind of ask there. But for me, there are some things that do change quite quickly. As you say, the sort of smiley face type of thing. How's it going? How's your week been? Is it fantastic, or is it thank goodness it's Friday? Why are you glad that it's Friday? Is it to do with your progress or your team or your project? And these things do change reasonably quickly and freely. As you say, if you've had a great conversation or a poor conversation with your boss, then those kind of things go up and down. I think the second thing is to just take a snapshot of engagement. Again, we found that people are quite willing to click on a smiley face and then maybe ask one or two other questions, and they'll answer those quite quickly. And maybe we start rolling these questions around about, well, how are you thinking this week, and the following week, how are you feeling, and the following week, how are you acting? And then some companies like to include something like, would you recommend this as a place to work? So having a small subset of questions and maybe asking one of those questions every week, we see that as quite attractive. And I think the other thing that a lot of companies ask for as well is, every now and again, maybe once a month, it'd be nice to have a free text question in there as well. So, what else could we be doing? What suggestions do you have? Have you got any great ideas or new challenges? Because on the one hand, we want to make this easy to take part in. We want it to be engaging and interesting, take less than 30 seconds every week probably, but we also want to just give people an opportunity to, I say vent sometimes, be innovative and challenging on other occasions. So does that sort of feel about right in terms of weekly and a couple of questions, that sort of thing?
Yeah, the thing, and you kind of pointed this out, is on a weekly basis, you shouldn't be asking the same set of questions to the same group of people every single time. You should be cycling through, hey, this week we're going to ask you this one, next week we'll ask you, by the time next month rolls around, we're coming back through those key questions again. So we're kind of getting this check, but it's not burdensome on the employee to have to respond to this. It's not, hey, here's your 25 questions every Friday. Good luck responding to that and getting your work done, because pretty soon you might get a response the first week, but it's going to start tapering off pretty quickly. So asking them some of those things and cycling through, I think, is important. And I love the last one on the slide here. What suggestions do you have? Because that's an area that I think helping people to feel like they're heard, helping people to feel like it's not just about, hey, we want to dig into how you're feeling about work and everything else, but we also want you to feel like you can contribute back, share some things. Hey, what's working? What's not working? Do you have an idea, suggestion? Like even getting those kind of things from people and giving them a chance to share that, I think is really important for just helping them feel connected to the business, helping them feel connected to the mission and all those other good things.
Yeah, there's a CEO of a company here in the UK, and he said, nobody knows my business better than the employees. He said there is no way that my senior management team know anything as much about the business as the people that work. He runs a chain, as you might expect in the UK, of pubs, and he's very, very successful. And he said, he tries to get around the pubs and visit and see what's happening there. But he said just the people in there know more than anybody else on the senior management team ever will. And so to really tap into that wisdom, I think is really important. Another extreme example, actually, this one might make you smile. I was talking to a bank in Norway, and they said, hey, this is great, but what if we get, they've I think got 10 or 11,000 employees. They said, hey, what happens if we get 10 or 11,000 suggestions every week? What will we do with them? And I said, well, I think you could probably retire and go home, because you've done your job. If you've got every single one of your employees actually making suggestions, then you really do have a fantastic two-way dialogue. So that's again, sometimes you've got to be careful what you wish for, and I guess you hope that technology will help you filter those. But for me, it made me smile, because I thought, what job done if you're getting that much feedback and connectivity really with the people working for you.
Yeah, there's a book that I love called The Idea-Driven Organization, and it's all about how to solicit ideas from your people. And the problem a lot of companies have is not that they get ideas from everyone. It's that your people are sitting there quietly doing their work, and they have a good idea for something, but they never raise their hand because they're afraid someone's going to tell them no. But they're afraid that someone's not going to be receptive to that. So this gives them a very non-invasive way to throw that idea out there. And if someone can take action on it, great. If it's one of 50 other ideas and it's relatively low in terms of priority because it's not as exciting as the other ones, that's fine too. But at least they had their say and you've captured those things. Going back to the other comment you made about the CEO of the pub chain, though, there's actually a similar story that I love telling. There's a CEO here in the U.S. based, what's his company? Scripps Health. So a big healthcare network. Lots and lots of hospitals, nurses, all that other fun stuff that goes along with that. And one of his favorite things to do is employees call it the dance. He'll go through one of his hospitals and he'll stop wherever there's little scuff marks on the floor, and he'll rub his shoe on that scuff mark to clean it up. And whenever one of his employees walks by, a nurse, a janitor, staff, an administrator, someone else, he stops them and talks to them. Hey, how's your work going? Is there anything that we can do to fix this? And not all of them even know who he is, but he just makes himself very present and puts himself right there in situations where he can have those conversations and understand, because he believes the same thing. Those people on the front lines see and understand more about what can be done for engagement. What can be done for innovation, what can be done to serve people better, process, all those kind of things. Sometimes better so than someone sitting in an office, in the corner office somewhere else, just making decisions without having that on the ground intelligence. So I love that story, and it's maybe not as excited as someone that's running a bunch of pubs, but the same sort of idea still applies.
Yeah, I think that's right. Let's move on a little bit. I've got this hypothesis that so far this sounds great, and to a certain extent it's nice to have. And I wonder if we can move this on so that it becomes almost a sort of a must-have. The way I illustrate this is a slight change to the diagram we had earlier on. So here's my annual survey 1 January, and here's my annual survey the following January. And here's where engagement is. It's at 75% as we measure it here. And again, it's a little bit like the customer here in the UK where I was speaking a while ago. He was saying, well, what happens if engagement during the year declines and we don't pick it up again until the following annual survey? And this does mean that the annual survey will pick up that big change in engagement, and it could be, on average, I guess it is going to be about 6 months after it becomes a problem. Whereas if we do something like 1 or 2 questions on sentiment, engagement, every week, let's say, then you do have this continuous listening pulse. This sometimes we call it snackable feedback or snackable insight. Just a little bits of information that give you just enough information that means you can detect that trend downward, at the point that it's happening, and therefore take action about it. And as I say, when I was talking to the HRD, this was the sort of picture that formed in my mind, and clearly he had in his mind. So I think what's really interesting, you touched on it a moment ago, is that you can listen, you can pick up these trends, and this surely will pick up a trend on engagement. But you've got to do something about what you're seeing, because otherwise you just kind of listen and hey, guess what? 6 months later, your engagement's fallen, down to whatever 25% or something, and you've had the luxury of seeing it do that every single week. Surely the secret is listen and then do something with what you're learning.
Yeah, I was going to say that the 6 month thing is just the average, right? There are times where it'll happen right here in February, and it pops up, something happens, and it takes a sharp dive. Maybe you make a policy change, or maybe your CEO turns over, or something really big at an organizational level, and you need to understand what's going on there. It might be a change that something happens that's not even related to a business decision, and yet it impacts your people. And so understanding it is hugely critical. And again, the 6 month thing is conservative in some cases. In some cases, yes, it might happen right before that, but the trend line will look different. But I definitely think that understanding this stuff, the sooner you can see that trend and really jump on it and try to make sense of, hey, what happened? You can even, once you kind of realize there's something going on, you can even use the next pulse that you're doing to really dig into, hey, we've seen this sort of trend. Can you explain, more open text questions maybe, or something like that, to understand what those issues are specifically, so that hopefully in the perfect world, we can level that off or even reverse that trend if it's something that we can actually solve for.
Yeah. Now, I'm a mathematician at heart, and I kind of remember these from my high school studies, charts like this, and the maths teacher would pop up and say, "Hey, what's the area under the graph?" And in this case, actually, what it is 6 months of lower productivity, profitability, retention, that staff turnover that you mentioned, and you can calculate this, and it's something that's going to cost a business money every day, because it is very well documented. Gallup, amongst others, did a meta survey a few years ago now where they had a look at the connection between engagement and things like productivity, profitability, staff turnover, absenteeism as well. And the links are very clear, and many studies since then have shown that connection. So, the sort of second part of my hypothesis is that, yes, listening is important, taking action is important. Actually, what you can do is you can put a dollar value on, action or inaction, I suppose, in many respects. Does this sort of make sense? I suppose are we moving this from being a nice to have to being a must have?
Yeah, I think that one of the challenges for HR leaders is that, again, I've been there, so I'm not pointing any fingers, but we're usually not very good at thinking about it from this perspective. We see that engagement number that went down or that engagement number that went up, and that's what we focus on. And like you said, engagement ultimately is not the outcome we're shooting for. Your CEO engagement might be a nice to have, but revenue, profitability, innovation, turnover, those things are must focus items. You can't go to an executive meeting and not have those numbers at hand, ready to talk about them, ready to understand them and share them. And so I remember, the time that I worked as an HR leader, those were the kind of things that I would come to an executive meeting, would sit down and be able to talk about those specific aspects. When I told my CEO that our engagement went down 10%, he would just give me a look like, what does that mean? What does it matter? And the thing is, every single person listening to this, it means something different to your business. If you're in healthcare, maybe it means that your patient satisfaction numbers are going down. If you're in manufacturing, it might be that your quality is going down. But you've got to understand what those things are that your CEO, your executive team care about, and how engagement connects into those specific things. Because the lever into a lot of areas. We talked about innovation a minute ago. It even connects into innovation in some studies. Again, Gallup's data says that people that are engaged are more likely to say that they have their best ideas at work and that their coworkers bring out their most creative ideas. So even that engagement thing we were talking about a minute ago isn't something we should take for granted. It's something that's deeply connected to this idea of engagement.
Yeah, and I remember the original Gallup survey mentioned safety incidents, and it said, companies with more highly engaged staff have fewer safety incidents. Now, you go back 4, 5 years, 10 years, those safety incidents were literally health and safety issues, in work, people getting injured, people being in dangerous environments, oil and gas and all of those things. But much more recently, people under that same category of safety incident have started to put cyber incidents, and actually the lower your average employee engagement score is, actually the more cyber incidents you have. You imagine somebody who's a little bit bored with their job, a little bit disengaged, into their inbox pops a really interesting looking email, and they just can't help but open it up and take a look at what it's promising them. And so they take a lot less care than a highly engaged employee might. Now, that is a safety incident. It's one that's going to, cost money. It's going to cost time, and certainly there was a big incident in the UK last year where quite a few businesses were affected by ransomware, which got in through emails that were opened up. Very clever, but again, you can't help but make that connection through to lower engaged staff actually being the ones that are more likely to open up those kind of emails.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the thing that gets me is if we think about this, like there's a concept called backward integrated design. Okay, and as an engineer, you probably would love this. It's basically, let's focus on the outcome and then design the process backwards from there. And why are we doing these continuous listening things? Is it because we like asking a lot of questions? Because if that's what you like, then you can just ask questions to your heart's content. But if it's about, we're going to try to improve our engagement, then let's try to ask the questions that are focused on those kind of things and driving those sorts of, that as a leading indicator of these other areas we're talking about here. Whether it's safety, it's productivity, it's any of those sorts of elements that really matter. But we need to be really focused on making sure that when we're asking questions that we're actually acting on, or we're asking questions that give us some intelligence that we can actually use and leveraging those things. That's one of the things, my pet peeve want to jump on the soapbox, is that when companies ask questions, you mentioned the company that asked 140 something questions. Like, I would challenge them: are you taking action on all of those things, or are you asking some of those because we've always done it that way? And so that's my little soapbox moment for survey design, because I ask a lot of questions. I do a lot of surveying and things myself when we're doing research, and I'm always very curious, or very careful otherwise, to only ask those questions that I can really take action on and use that data point. And I think companies might get, I won't say lazy necessarily, it's kind of rough to call it lazy, but companies should be really careful about how they design those things.
Yeah, I think that's right. It actually leads on quite nicely to the last thing I wanted to sort of talk about, and that's sort of bring it all back to a human level. We've had a fly through the mechanics of continuous listening, why it's a nice thing to have, why it's a must-have, and as you said, it's quite easy to focus down on those numbers, try to raise the engagement score. Much better to think about the cost. I mean, actually, in terms of cost, it's a great way of creating a business case for anything, is to show what impact fixing something will actually have. So, I think that is an important part of it. But then flipping the coin over, this very human side of things, I got to thinking, well, how does this feel for individuals in the business? And at the highest level, you have your executives who want to see the big picture. They want to have a look across their entire organization. They want to see, if they make a decision about something, whether it's buying another company, or whether they're just doing their quarterly updates to the company. What sort of effect does that have on engagement? And you do see, it's interesting. I remember one company I was at. Every time there was a CEO webcast, and this went out to the world. It wasn't just an internal one. We'd all have a look at the share price afterward, but nobody looked at the employee engagement index as a result. And I thought that was quite telling, really, from that perspective. One company I was speaking with in Sweden, actually, they when I was talking to them about this, they said, well, do you know what? Actually, what would be great is if we could work out as we're going through the year, how engagement is across all of our stores, and if we can match that with the stores that are doing well and selling more, and have got more customers going through there, and the store satisfaction scores are high. What's the connection through to engagement? And then if we have maybe 2 or 3 stores that are not doing quite so well, it would be great to do a deep dive into that area and see what's happening there. So again, on the one level, you've got company-wide information. You don't need to follow that up with another company-wide survey because you know where the problem areas lie in those 2 stores in that particular example.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's where the qualitative, the open text piece really factors in, right? Because if you see that this score is lower than that store over there, then you can look at some of those qualitative things and see, the leader never gives me a shift on, in advance, or my, there's always this issue with closing up the shop or whatever else. There's all these different possible scenarios that could cause issues for those people. And when you flip the coin, you look at the people that are working at a store that are highly engaged, usually that's attributed in some way to the leader, and we know that. But you get to see the kind of things that leader's doing differently. That was one of the things years and years ago. I worked for a company where we had some turnover issues ourselves, not quite 150%. We were at like 50% a year. And goodness, I actually had gone through and done an analysis to look at different leaders in the company to see, okay, this is the big bucket, but what does it look like by manager? And we had a manager that was under 10%. He was doing some really great things to engage his team. On the other side of the spectrum, there was a manager that had 70+% turnover in her team. And so I was really trying to understand, what are the things she's doing, because she's got to stop doing some of those. And what is this other gentleman doing that's doing really great, because we've got to try to map his practices and his processes to the rest of our managers and leaders, because they need to follow his example. Because I knew that it was costing us tens of thousands of dollars a year to train these people, to hire them, to recruit them, to do all these things. And we could have made some impact on that if we had only taken a moment to really look at what those things were in the survey data that we had.
Yeah, that's a great story to end on. I think it's a great example of the potential benefits of listening continuously, realizing where there are issues, where there are opportunities, where there are best practices, and rolling those out across the business. We have unfortunately run out of time. It's been a fantastic conversation. Thanks, Ben, for sharing your thoughts, your perspective, and your very real-world experience. I've certainly learned a lot, as usual, and it certainly helps me to shape my thinking. And I hope that people listening and watching will also feel the same. So thanks very much, Ben.
This has been so much fun, Scott. Thank you again for having me.
No worries. Thanks, everybody.